My goal is to put information on the table. Information about the Hebrew text, information about the ancient world, information about interpretation options. And that just gives us more to work with as we try to sort things out. So I'm going to go right to the hermeneutical, methodological foundation for what I do. The table's been set in many ways already for this conversation, and so we're going to start there. And I'll do this a little more briefly than I usually do, but we'll get to these issues. So, biblical authority. Most of us would say biblical authority is important to us. What do we mean by that? And we have to have that pretty clear in our minds. The idea we have is that God had a purpose, that purpose in communication, and that purpose was carried out through human instrumentation. So a human Israelite from the ancient world was given a message by God in whatever way that happened, and therefore we can get to God's purpose through that human author. The authority of God is vested in that author, and therefore if we want to know what God had to say, we know the doorway to go to. We know how to get to that. The Bible then was written for us, for all of us, God's word to us, but it was not written to us. The message, we believe, transcends its culture, but that message is in a form that is culture bound. And we have to recognize that when we are trying to understand the text. That means that we have to take our place in that audience. We can't afford just to sit where we are and expect the text to come to us. We've got to try to penetrate that context of communication. And therefore, our key to understand God's purpose in his revelation is to try to penetrate the ancient text, the ancient culture that ancient author and audience would have been involved in. So that's the basic method that takes us into this material. We don't treat the Bible as a science book. We don't treat it as dealing kind of covertly with advanced scientific issues. It is what the author communicated it to be, because that's who God worked through. So, when we look at this ancient world then, we're trying to get into this audience and we're trying to understand the ancient world, but we have to be careful what we're doing with that. We understand that literature from the ancient Near East is not inspired, is not authoritative, but it gives us a window to the world in which the Israelites lived and in which the authors communicated. And we need to take advantage of that window. Okay, we recognize the differences in the literature, but we've got some 1 million plus cuneiform texts that help us to understand that world. We can never become totally aware of how a Babylonian or a Canaanite would have thought, but we can at least get deep enough into it that we can recognize ways that we think today that they did not think back then. And if we can do enough to kind of stop from imposing our own world on the Bible, that's a great step in the right direction. So when we look at this material, we don't want to import or impose ancient Near East on the biblical text. We recognize that this is a different quality of literature, but it is the ancient world, and we need to take account of that. The Babylonians and the Egyptians had a lot more in common with the Israelites than we do. Right? The Babylonians and Egyptians could understand an Israelite text. The Israelites could understand Babylonian and Israelite texts. None of them would be able to interact with our world. We have to recognize that's part of how that works. So we don't import it or impose it, but we do understand that ancient Near Eastern texts can prompt us to think about the Bible differently than how we would normally do in our modern or postmodern or post-enlightenment or scientific world. Okay, we need help, and the ancient texts can help us. They don't dictate, but they prompt us. In much the same way that science can prompt us to look at the biblical material again. So, it provides windows for us, windows by which we can understand these people and these times, how they thought in the ancient world. That's so we can avoid anachronistic interpretation. We dare not impose our own world on the Bible. It has authority for what it is, okay? So that's the authority issues. A couple quick comments on science in the Bible. First of all, one of the key differences between our world and the ancient world concerns the issue of natural and supernatural. That is a divide in our modern way of thinking, at least since the Enlightenment. This division, you've got things that are natural laws, natural cause and effect, natural world, natural science, okay, naturalism. And then we think in terms of supernatural, that is, that it transcends any natural explanation. Please understand, these are our categories. They are not ancient categories. There is no such thing as natural laws or natural cause and effect in the ancient world. They believed that gods or God were involved in everything. There's nothing the gods weren't doing or the God of Israel was not doing. So they wouldn't think about a miracle, that's something God did, opposed to these other things that what, God didn't do? No way of thinking that way in the ancient world. There's no Kantian divide. There's no Enlightenment thinking here. Ancient world, God is the one doing everything. Therefore, when the Bible talks about God doing something, whatever it is, you cannot say, well, if God's doing it, then it must not have a natural explanation. That whole approach assumes a post-Enlightenment way of thinking. We have to understand how people in the ancient world thought. We don't want to impose our division of categories on the ancient world. Okay? When it talks about God making something, God makes everything. There's no idea that, well, if God made it, well then, we can't bring science into the picture. Doesn't work that way. Okay? Secondly, observation then of natural cause and effect doesn't remove God from the picture. Of course not. Natural cause and effect is our way of thinking, not theirs. So just because we could observe that such and such, maybe it's one of the plagues, maybe it's one of the acts of God that we see, a hailstorm, who knows? Just because we might be able to think we can explain it by natural cause and effect, doesn't mean God's out of it. Psalm 139:13, you knit me together in my mother's womb. Or you turn the lights on. Okay. Okay, everything is something God is doing. If we make a statement that something supernatural is what God's doing, we're implying that other things are not God's work. I don't think we're going to go there theologically. Okay? So, next, there is no scientific revelation. God does not upgrade their science. Now, by scientific here, I'm talking about the regular way that things work. Okay? God does not reveal to them new ways of thinking about the regular ways that things work. Okay? He doesn't give them a new theory about rain and how that happens. He doesn't give them a new view of cosmic geography. And he doesn't give them a new view of physiology. In the ancient world, everybody believed that all of the cognitive processes that we understand to be associated with the brain, their physiology places them all down here. Heart, liver, kidneys, stomach. I think with my stomach. But at any rate, that all of those things, they didn't have any true physiology understanding of the kidneys or the liver. And they thought all of those were connected with cognitive processes. This was not just metaphor for them. This is their physiology. They have no physiology of the brain. There is no ancient Hebrew word for brain. And when the Hebrew text might occasionally translate mind in the English translations, that's the word for intestines, for guts. Okay? Your translator helped you. Anyway, so God is not beefing up their scientific information in his revelation of himself. This is God's revelation of himself, not of science. So, there's no new scientific revelation. There's not a thing in the Old Testament, I went through the whole thing in my background commentary work, not a thing there that could not be explained in an ancient world context. Matter of fact, it's exactly what you expect, and God has accommodated that because he talks about believing with your heart and thinking with your heart and loving with your heart. Excuse me, God, you got the physiology wrong. No, we don't do that. We understand that he's working in that context. No new scientific revelation. Now, that means we must consider carefully what scientific claims the Bible's making. If it's not teaching us science, and if it has a different way of thinking about the world around us, And if there's no new scientific revelation, then how can we talk about the Bible making scientific claims? See, that's a question we have to face. And so that leads us to ask, what claims is the Bible making? And that's really what I want to talk about. What are the biblical claims? I'm not trying to pit science and the Bible against one another or try to understand that intersection. I'm trying to understand what claims the Bible makes, because we can't even think about how we're going to enter into the discussion with science if we don't have an idea of what claims the Bible makes. And I can tell you that the claims the Bible makes means everything to me. It's my starting point. It's my life. It's my work. And I would never want to go beyond what the Bible's claims are. But I feel that often in this conversation, that's exactly what's happening. On all ends of the spectrum, we misrepresent what the Bible's claims are. So let's take a look at it carefully. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a scientist. You know, the standard disclaimers here. I'm not a scientist. I am a text analyst. Okay? And that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a good look at the text. So, Genesis 2 and 3 is our focus. Now, I want to start with what our intuitions are, kind of the preconceived notions we might have about Genesis 2. The standard default is to believe that in Genesis 2, we have a recapitulation of day 6. Now, there's some good arguments why that shouldn't be the case, but it's kind of goes back and forth. There's good reasons why people would think it is the case. Okay, because after all, you had people created in day 6, and this is people being created, and so seems like it works. Are Adam and Eve the people in Genesis 1? Genesis 1 does not refer to Adam and Eve. Genesis 1 does not talk about two people. So, in that sense, we can't assume that Genesis 1 and Adam and Eve kind of belong together. But of course, we've always assumed they did, and that's because what else would you make of Genesis 2? If you didn't put it, kind of read it back in to Genesis 1, what in the world would be going on? Great question. But you probably didn't ask that ever before, because we assumed we knew. Part of our approach to the text has to mean that we are reading fresh all the time as best we can, asking questions that we've assumed we knew the answers to. So let's talk about it. We have in between Genesis 1 and 2, we have a transition, a literary transition. It's a very well-known one in Genesis 1, whole book of Genesis. There are 11 times where it uses this Hebrew word toledot. This is the account, the toledot of the heavens and the earth. 11 times through the book. This is a structural element. Now, that's cool, because that means we can ask throughout the book, how does this structural element work? What's the relationship between what comes before that structural element and what comes after it? Is there a pattern? Can that help us understand the ways that we should read these texts together? So, there's the chart with all of them. Let's read them together quick. No, we're not going to do that. Okay, so we take a look at these, and we notice that there are a couple ways that they work. If we were going to read Genesis 2 as pertaining to day 6, that would be recapitulative. It's recapitulating day 6 with a little more detail about Adam and Eve. Okay? So that's the one that we really want to keep an eye out for. Recapitulation. Of course, you can see from my list here that recapitulation is not on the list. Primarily, between the two segments that the introduction separates, we have sequel relationships. You're moving on to what's next, and it might be just right after, or it might be a long time after, but it's a sequel. There are a few cases you can see where it's recursive. The recursive model happens typically when you've got brothers. So it'll deal with Ishmael, and then it'll come back, and it won't recapitulate Ishmael's story, but it'll recur back to that time period and then deal with Isaac. Okay, so brothers together. And so the recursions occur when you've got brothers. track Esau, now come back and pick up Jacob. Okay? So we find that when we look at all the other places where this structural element is used, that none of them are recapitulative. Now, that doesn't mean that Genesis 2 could not recapitulate Genesis 1, but you wouldn't have supporting evidence for it. Maybe this is the only one that does. Well, if you're good with that, I don't know. But at any rate, we should at least be led to think, okay, what would it look like if Genesis 2 is a sequel? What would that tell us about Genesis 2? And if it is a sequel, then what's happening with all of this? Why is Genesis 2 there? Now, if it's a sequel, that means that people in Genesis 1 are not necessarily Adam and Eve. Or maybe Adam and Eve is among that population, and that it's going to pick up something specific about them in chapter 2. There are a variety of different possibilities. Okay, but it wouldn't be a slam dunk that Genesis 1 was about Adam and Eve. The second account then does not need to fit into day 6, which has been a problem for some. I mean, a lot goes on in Genesis 2 that you have trouble, depending how you think about a day, but you know, there's a lot going on there. So that would alleviate that a little bit. By the way, having more people around does resolve some things, and that's been mentioned a couple times already. Cain finds a wife. You know, I never cared for the sister option, just saying. I don't know how you feel about that, okay? You know, Cain's afraid that when he's driven out, that now everybody who finds him is going to kill him. Mom, is that you? Dad? I mean, what are our options here? You know, he builds a city. You can't build a city for yourself. You don't call that a city. You call it a man cave. Oh, never mind. Okay. So what do we have going on here? You know, we have to be alert to the kind of things the text shows us. So there's good reason at least to consider as an option that we're dealing with a sequel in some sense, and try to see where that possibility takes us. Again, we just want to measure the claims. You can't just start in with the claim that Genesis 2 is day 6. You can't assume it. You've got to try to demonstrate it. So, where does this all take us? My proposal, as many of you know, for Adam and Eve, and Scott mentioned the terminology this morning, is that we've got some archetypal things going on here. So let me explain a little what I mean by that. What I'm claiming basically is that everything in Genesis 2 regarding human origins, okay, make sure you have that in there, regarding human origins, is first and foremost archetypal. That doesn't mean everything in Genesis 2 is archetypal, but regarding human origins. Now, by archetypal, I'm not talking about just a pure literary archetype, okay? A literary archetype is sort of a category that characters in a story could fit into. The villain, the hero, the damsel in distress, the Bilbo. Oh, wait. Okay. So the archetypal kinds of ideas, that's a literary thing, and I'm not quite talking about that. I'm also not talking about the idea of a prototype. Okay? A prototype is just the first in a series. With an archetype, there's more going on. There's some sense of embodiment, of a high level of representation that goes beyond what a prototype would do. Okay? So it's not just prototypes, but it's an archetypal representation. I'm suggesting that the forming accounts are most relevant to Adam and Eve as archetypes rather than individuals. See, now Scott would be proud of me that I have Adam and Eve there, okay? But that this is relevant to them as archetypes. Now, a very fair question would be, how would you know? I mean, isn't it just what you make up, what you decide it is, that makes a difference? Okay, and this is a part that Scott read to you this morning. It was really nice of him to read sections of my book there. But the way that we can make that determination in some sort of objective way is that they're identified as archetypal if it refers to everyone and not just individuals. You ask the question, is this statement about Adam or Eve or both, is that something that's true uniquely and only of them, or is it something that's true of everyone? If it's true of everyone, it's archetypal in nature. Okay, so that's the kind of approach we're taking to try to understand what we're dealing with here in the text. Okay, so let's start with being formed from dust. Lots of people, when they think about this, in today's world might be inclined to think that we're dealing with chemistry here. And they'll talk about how dust might have the same kind of chemical components as the human body has, and they'll try to talk about all of those. Or they might even get talking about stardust and things of that sort. Okay? Chemistry is not the way that the Israelites would have thought. A second and probably more popular option is to think about craftsmanship. Okay, I mean, here's God getting down and dirty, getting his hands into it and actually forming the human body. I mean, this is really God at his most condescending, Well, that's a great idea, except if that were really the idea that the text wanted to give, then you would think they would have used clay, because dust cannot be formed. You say, well, God can do whatever he wants. Yeah, well, he would use clay if he wanted to get across being formed. Okay? You can't form dust. So now we've got a conundrum. If it's not chemistry and it's not craftsmanship, then what's going on with the dust thing? We finally ask the question. Should have asked it long ago. But see, we don't do that. We make assumptions. We have preconceptions. So what's going on with the dust thing? Okay, now, some people think that we've got a little bit of a difficulty here because when we look at the biblical text, we find out just a chapter later, 3:19, dust you are and to dust you shall return. And that suggests that dust is connected to our mortal frailty, our mortality. But that's never been a popular option, because if that pertains to mortality, that means that Adam was created mortal. And people say, that can't be the case. Paul disagrees. Paul says that Adam was created immortal. No, he doesn't. Paul says that we are subject to death because of sin. That's not the same thing as saying that we were created mortal. I mean, let's think back to Genesis 2 and 3. One of the key features of the garden is the tree of life. Immortal people don't need a tree of life. That's a waste of a good tree. Why would God put a tree of life in the garden if people are immortal? And so we immediately have this question to ask, well, now Paul's got a problem with Genesis 2 and 3 when he says what he says. But see, it's really not a problem at all. Paul says that we humans are subject to death because of sin. So what happened? God put this tree of life in a garden, and there are people in that garden who are mortal, and the tree of life is there to sustain their life as a remedy, as an antidote to their natural mortality. God provided a gift that would allow them to transcend their mortality and have life available. But then they sinned, and how does the text express God bringing about the punishment? He casts them out of the garden and sets up this fierce beastie, the cherub, to guard the way to the tree of life. Without the tree of life, they have no antidote, no remedy, and therefore they are doomed to their mortality. And therefore, because of sin, we are subject to death. Now, let's talk more about this dust thing. Because now we want to know, what is it that the Bible is claiming with all of this? What is the significance of dust? Is this something that is uniquely true of Adam? That all the rest of us were born from a woman after a 9-month gestation period, but Adam uniquely was made from dust. Well, is that really the biblical view? I'm looking at Psalm 103:14 here. For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. Dust and formed shows us that the psalmist here is reflecting on Genesis chapter 2. But notice that nice little pronoun there, we. You've read through it before, but look at that. We are formed from dust. Every human being is formed from dust. This is not unique to Adam. We are all formed from dust. Paul says it too. The first man is of dust, and all from dust. This is who we are. We're dusty people. Okay? So this is the Bible making this claim, and we have to pay attention to it. Now, that means that being formed from dust does not describe material formation. Because you are each formed from dust. I know Grand Rapids is a special place, but really, you each are formed from dust. You each are born of woman and formed from dust, and therefore, formed from dust does not describe your material origin. It describes your identity. Being formed from dust would not preclude being born of a woman. You're all examples of that. So that means that dust statement is true of all of us. It does not pertain to material origin of any of us or to Adam. It describes his identity, his mortality, his frailty. That's who Adam was, and that's who we all are. That is what humankind is. It's our identity. It's intended to communicate what all humans are, not what Adam uniquely is, and that's why I identify it as an archetypal element. Well, what about woman? Yeah, what about woman? Okay, what about woman? Does Adam believe that Eve is built from his rib? And you're all hesitant to acknowledge this because you know it's a trick question. Yeah, it is. No, of course he doesn't. How do I know that? The Bible tells me so. Adam's first words. Bone of my bone, and he didn't stop there. Flesh of my flesh. There's more than a rib going on here. What is it? What kind of statement's being made here? This is not just a rib bone of Adam. This is talking about something more significant. This whole side, we talk about a side of beef, or at least a rack of ribs. I hate it when that rack of ribs is just bones, Okay? So we're talking about something more going on. So now we're curious. So let's take a look at all the places in the Hebrew Bible where it uses this Hebrew term, tselah, to describe anatomy. And we'll sort this out. We're done. There are none. This is the only occurrence in the Hebrew text where this word is used to describe something anatomical. Okay, now we've got trouble because now we have to try to figure out what in the world this Hebrew word means. Now, the Israelites left us a lot of books, but a dictionary was not among them. And so we have to do this work ourselves to try to sort out what it means. It turns out this word is used architecturally and directionally. In architecture, it's one side of a pair. Directionally, it might be the north side and the south side, the east side, the west side, something of that sort. Okay, but it definitely talks about something a little more comprehensive than just a rib bone. Okay, so we're talking about the side of Adam. God took one of Adam's sides, took half of him, presumably the better half from what common wisdom tells us, okay? He took half of him and he built half of him into the woman. This is carried out in the earliest translations, Aramaic, Septuagint Greek, Vulgate, all are ambiguous about this. They use words that can refer to the side, but sometimes are something more specific. So they don't solve the issue for us. 3rd and 4th century, as early as that, AD, Rabbi Samuel ben Nachmani was already in this argument saying that it's dealing with the side, not just a rib. This argument goes way back. So what are we dealing with here? How can we think through this issue? Well, if we're going to think about God taking one of Adam's sides, half of him virtually, we would say that's pretty radical surgery. As well it would be, but why in the world should we think that the Israelites would think about surgery? That's not kind of in the way that their world works. So what makes us think it's surgery? I mean, God put Adam under anesthesia? I mean, this is not the ancient world. Let's think ancient world. So God put him in a deep sleep. What does this deep sleep pertain to? The Hebrew occurs both in terms of a verb and a noun. It doesn't occur a lot of times, but enough times for us to get a shot at it. There are two different ways that it can be used. One is when there's a situation where there's danger. Where, for instance, Saul's asleep when David creeps into his camp, and his life is in danger and he doesn't know it. Jonah's in a deep sleep when the storm's going on and the boat is looking like it's going to fall apart. These kinds of danger when Sisera flees from Deborah and Barak and ends up in the tent of Jael and Hever and thinks he's safe, and warm milk and a nice warm cover, and yeah, next thing you know, she's holding a tent peg and a hammer. It turns into another temple story, by the way, but I won't go into the details. Okay, so, okay, they said after dinner I have to do this to kind of keep you, yeah. Okay, so that's one way. Now, we really don't want to go that direction with this, because that would mean Adam's asleep and there's danger coming. Oh no, woman is, okay, so we don't want to go that direction. Okay, so What's the other alternative here? Let's take a look at this. The other alternative is that this is the term that's used when God is preparing someone for a visionary experience. So, for instance, when he's unresponsive to the human realm, correspondingly responsive to communication in the divine realm. This is true of Abraham in Genesis 15. That's the ratification of the covenant. Pretty big deal. And it's taking place in a dream state, a visionary state. Abraham's cut the pieces in half, and in this dream, the torch and the censer pass between them, and the covenant's ratified. So this visionary state is the other alternative. And so this gives us another way of thinking about this Genesis passage. It's not surgery. God is showing Adam something very, very important in a dream. Okay, now again, translations, Septuagint uses ecstasis, which hints at a visionary state, and as early as Tertullian, this was considered a possibility. So we can see past information that helps with that. So what's going on? Remember that all of this starts out when God assigns Adam a task in the garden, and then he says it's not good for man to be alone. And then so as a result, Adam starts taking a look at all the animals. Now, when he says it's not good for man to be alone, that isn't he needs a pet. So let's bring the animals in. It certainly doesn't mean he needs a reproduction partner, not going there. So why do we have the animals involved, and what's going on in this situation? Okay, what's going on with Abraham that it's not good for him to be alone? Well, he's got a job to do. And the idea that he would have an ally in this job is what's going on here. None of the animals are going to be his allies. He names them, he recognizes their nature and their role, but they're not going to be his allies because they are not his ontological equal. They are not the same as him, and therefore they cannot be allies in this task. And so what God shows Adam about Eve is that she is not just another creature. She is indeed his ontological equal of the same essence as himself, and therefore an appropriate ally in the task that they have been given. And so in that way, Eve is put in place. It's not as if this is the first woman ever formed materially. This is not about her material formation. It is about her identity as the ontological equal of Adam. And that's why the text says, that's why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh again. That's what happens in marriage. These ontological halves are joined together, and that's why we have the attraction. This is not about each individual person, it's about the species. It's the identity of humanity, just like the dusk was about the identity of humanity. So as a result, we ask, what task are they to be engaged in? That comes in Genesis 2:15, translated a variety of different ways, serve and keep. What's going on with these terms? The first term, work or serve, could be interpreted as agricultural landscaping tasks, but that's typically only when it has the ground as its direct object, which does not here. The garden is the direct object, and that is not just ground, that is sacred space. Okay, the helpmeet is that he's got an ally in Eve, and the terminology then, serve, is a term most frequently used regarding sacred space, connected to the activity of priests in sacred space. And the verb for keep is also used for priestly functions in sacred space. God has set up sacred space. That's what Eden is. And Adam and Eve are giving a priestly task. This is their origin of their priestly roles that they have been chosen for, not their material biological origins. They're different from the creation of people in chapter 1 because here they are elect to serve however many people are there in this priestly role. The priestly representation is different from the archetypal representation because priestly representation does not include embodiment. Yet what priests do can affect the whole population. We know this in the Old Testament. We should understand them as priests, not as those offering sacrifices. That's only one minor part of what a priest does. We should think of them as priests in the same way that Israel is a kingdom of priests. Israel is not offering sacrifices for the other nations. They are a kingdom of priests because they are mediating knowledge of God and mediating access to God's presence who dwells in their midst. That's their priestly role. And we could talk about the church as a royal priesthood as well and talk about those same kind of ideas. So Adam and Eve are distinct because of this priestly role, not unique because of their material origins. The biblical text makes no claims about their material origins for the sake of biological clarification. So when we talk about archetypes, if the details of the forming apply to the archetypes, then we have no information about the forming of the individuals or about biological human origins. In other words, I'm saying once we recognize the claims the text does make, that also helps us to understand the claims the text does not make. Archetypal identity does not negate the existence of the individual. I loved Scott's paper this morning. Those categories are very helpful. You know, are we dealing with biographical Adam or literary Adam? Again, literary doesn't mean fictional, and it certainly doesn't mean mythological. Okay, but he is a literary character that is being portrayed by the narrator with certain intentions. Okay, none of these affect whether there is a person, a real person in a real past behind all of this. My impulse is historical, so I'm assuming that, but that's not the idea of the archetypal identity that's going on here. The appropriate question then is not, is this really what happened? That thing's only in terms of event. The truth is bigger than an event here. Truth can transcend events. This is about human identity, which we all understand is very much more important than whatever event took place. So the message of Genesis archetypes, very briefly, time is fleeing. So, created with mortal bodies, provisioned by God in the garden, given the role of serving in sacred space, divided into male and female. Okay, these are the issues of the archetypal lessons, the message of Genesis. They're important theological messages. And I should also note in that last bullet point, the archetypal ingredients is typical of the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, almost every time they talk about human origins, they talk about ingredients. Clay, dust, blood, spit, tears, all kinds of things. Blood, sweat, and tears. No, never mind. Okay, so this is typical of the ancient world, that archetypes are built into the choice of ingredients. Now, let's put together some of the theological issues. First of all, at the right time in his purposes, God conferred his image on all people. I don't see any way around. Image is in Genesis 1, not Genesis 2. So when God confers the image, however he does that, and I don't believe that's biologically traceable, he gives his image to all people. That is a task, a function that he gives them. And I don't have time to cover the image of God tonight. This identity and function is given by God, and that's what makes humanity distinct from its genetic predecessors. Okay, it's the image of God that makes them distinct, and that's given by God. It's not something you could detect in the genetic, archaeological record. Adam and Eve are real people in a real past, are representatives through whose actions we all became accountable for sin and therefore subject to it. Accountability is a big issue here. You cannot have the category sin without the accompanying accountability. Your dog can't sin, contrary to how it feels some days. Your dog can't sin. Okay, accountability is key. I got that from Paul, but okay. We are consequently doomed to death without the remedy of the death of Christ, provided for our salvation. See, separating out the biological feature does not mean you forfeit the historical, literary, real person, real past, and it does not mean you forfeit the doctrine of sin. Doctrine of sin is still problematic, and I'm sure glad we have a lot of people working on that. Okay, but we don't forfeit that just because we separate out the idea of biological origins. Putting together science issues. Okay, God's creation of humans potentially involved a long process. That could be possible, given what we have in Genesis. Designed and executed such that it resulted in phylogenetic continuity between species via change over time from a common ancestor. Nothing in the biblical text would offer a claim against that. Okay? This is really important. What's most important about this whole issue is that we are more than what we are made of. That's really the whole issue behind the evolution discussion. Biology is trivial. Sorry for you biologists. I mean, it's important. But it's who we are. And God has made us who we are, regardless of what we're made from. Whether you think it was straight from dust, or whether you look at a common ancestor, or whether you look at primates, or whether you look at amoeba, whatever it was, God has made us more than that. And that's what we stand on. So we have to keep that piece in place. God did it, and it evolved, are not mutually exclusive. Again, God's activity is not dependent on whether we have a scientifically definable or describable process. No need to accept any particular evolutionary model. I'm not going to go into that right now. But this idea is compatible with faithful interpretation. Now, do I have time to do this? Very quickly. An evolutionary creation model for sin and death. I don't feel I can stop without giving something about this. Okay, first of all, I've talked about unbundling. Unbundle the issues. Deal with them individually. Biological origins, sin and death, real person and real past. So, in God's time, the image was given. We can't define that. The image, as I see it, is largely a function and an identity. People are dying, just like creatures were dying. But they're not accountable. They're not accountable. And therefore, we would talk about original innocence. Adam and Eve are distinguished as priests, not biological, first and only of the species. But what God did was give a hope for life in God's presence, the tree of life. They disobeyed, they were cast out. Science can't talk about that. All lost hope of life because they became subject to death. Science can't talk about that. It can only talk about the pervasive death that takes place. Disorder brought into the cosmos, to which we are now all subject. So sin and accountability and disorder came on all. Okay, again, there's various models of original sin that can cover all of that. How should we think? The importance of recognizing the Bible's claims. We have to take that task seriously. We can't just rest on the laurels of historical interpretation and English translations. The acceptance of those who choose differently. There are a lot of things up for grabs here, and there are still things we're sorting out. Let's keep thinking. Let's keep talking. Let's keep working through the text, and let's recognize that the person sitting next to you is your brother or sister in Christ, even if they come to different conclusions. We should also recognize then the acceptance of science does not require the rejection of the Bible or faith. Again, I don't see that the competing claims are being made. This is very important for us to recognize. It's important because so much of what we do in ministry, so much of what we do in evangelism, so much of what we see happening in attrition away from the church is all bound into this issue. And therefore, we need to take it seriously. I know I'm preaching to the choir. You all take it seriously because you're here, regardless of what your conclusions are. We need to be able to minister in our churches to people who are in the sciences. And we need to prepare our children and our grandchildren to go into the sciences if they're so inclined, so that we have that kind of presence in the sciences of people committed to God and His Word. Thank you very much.